My wife's family is loud, especially my mother-in-law. She strives toward propriety, but in doing so, often becomes somehow more offensive. I think she knows it's impolite, but if a character in whatever story she's relaying is of a different race or handicapped or a Democrat, this is an essential detail. Her solution is to wildly look around wherever she is to ensure no one of the demographic in question is present, then whisper it anyway. Now, this new woman at my Bible study, well, I wondered how comfortable she felt, being black at a church like ours. I thought it was brave, honestly, but you know how some people are. Begging the question, does whispering ever make it better? My family is quiet, especially my dad. He moved around a lot as a kid, and his only sibling, a brother, died before I was born. Details about Dad's life prior to my existence are always a bit murky due to his relative silence and the fact that I didn't have any cousins or anybody else to fill me in on the backstory. Early one summer, at the end of my 8th grade year, my dad's mom died. 3 years later, Grandpa followed her. The next week, my parents and I drove to Oklahoma. There were cars to sell, official documents to go through, and massive amounts of junk in the house, an archive of 2 lives. All my dad's responsibility as the lone survivor. In an odd way, I enjoyed this trip because I liked feeling useful. Walking into their house, the same one my dad lived in during high school, the tension and the heaviness lingered along the faux-paneled wood walls. Sepia-toned pictures lined the hallways. My grandparents' wedding, my dad as a child in Kansas City, my great-aunt and uncle in Phoenix. There were newer pictures, too, my sister and I, the only grandchildren. Strangely absent from their home was any record of my late uncle. He lived there, I assumed, but there was no physical evidence. The few times I remember being brave enough to ask about him, I was given short, dismissive answers. I busied myself going through my grandmother's half of the master bedroom closet, left untouched for years by my grandfather. I started in on a stack of shoeboxes full of old pictures, which were still in the tattered black envelopes from the developer, the negatives spilling everywhere. I didn't know you had a mustache, I called to my father, who was in the adjacent bedroom. He walked in, and I showed him the old photograph. I didn't. He paused. That's Paul. Paul? I stared open-mouthed at my uncle. Paul was handsome, skinny, and cool, the opposite of everything my high school self saw in my own father. This was the first picture of him I'd ever seen, which seems strange. But then again, maybe it isn't. Are men supposed to keep pictures of their dead siblings on the wall? At least Dad mentioned Paul sporadically, whereas I'd never heard either of my grandparents even say his name. He doesn't have red hair like us and Grandma. He was adopted. I'd never heard this. In fact, everything I knew about my uncle was gleaned through whispers, biennial mentions of him obscured through glimpses of deep emotions and quick changes of subject. I raced to mentally catalog everything I knew about Paul. I'd pieced together that there was some amount of time after my parents moved to Dallas, but before my sister was born in 1983, that Paul had lived with them. I assumed that his death was a sudden one, as my dad was working in the Philippines at the time and once mentioned a nightmare 22-hour travel marathon to make it home in time for the funeral. How did Paul die? I asked. He got very sick. I waited for what was, in my estimation, an adequately serious amount of time before asking the very obvious follow-up question. What did he have? You don't know? My eyes dropped and my intestines hardened. The same sinking feeling as when a teacher asked everyone to turn in an assignment that I didn't know existed. Had I missed something? No. My dad looked around the room slowly. My brother was, Paul was, gay. He had AIDS. It was so fast. He died before in '85 before we even knew what it was. Dad turned his eyes back toward mine, and looking through the mist and fog of my father's sadness, I instantly knew everything about the uncle I'd never met. I saw how much my father loved him and looked up to him. I saw my dad as a geeky middle schooler pining for his older brother's attention and stealing listens of his records at every opportunity. I saw my parents argue for the first time in their young marriage, my dad insisting to let his brother stay with them in the new city just until he got back on his feet. I saw the agonizing decision to ask him to leave after my older sister was born, forced to choose between protecting his daughter or his brother. Shifting my gaze toward the next photo in the envelope, I saw my grandparents locked in their signature Puritan stare, a real-life American Gothic. They'd known Paul was different, but naively assumed that was just a big city rubbed off on him. I saw their horror in the hospital, learning for the first time what a homosexual looked like when they met their son's boyfriend, draped, weeping over their son's lifeless body. I felt their confusion and anger when the entire gay community of northern Oklahoma crashed their son's funeral at the First Baptist Church. I heard the whispered conversation among the deacons. Surely we've got to do something about them. They can't stay here. I saw the 2 decades that followed, the sudden shock of pain dulled to a solemn, heartbroken silence. I never knew, I said. I figured you'd have just picked up on it at some point. Or maybe these kind of things just aren't meant to be talked about. These kind of things. I still don't know for sure, but I think that Dad meant that some things can't be explained. Their understanding has to be absorbed over time. His brother's memory still occasionally drops by unannounced, like many living uncles do. But the memory is a complicated one, equal parts pain and joy, equal parts shame and pride. These kind of things are so emotional, so deep, so inexorably embedded into every bit of lived life that the only way they can be perceived is through the extended white space of a wide margin. I think I disagree. It's impolite and sometimes uncomfortable, but I'm fascinated with these kind of things. Some of my favorite experiences involve staying up late, cheap whiskey, and hashing out every angle of a difficult personal struggle. I relish that awkward moment after a hard question when someone looks at you as if to say, "Oh my God, I thought I was the only one who wondered about those things." Instead of living in fear of ghosts, I'd rather turn on the lights and see what it is that's casting that scary-looking shadow on the wall. I've learned that at least most of the time, whatever we were afraid of was actually just a stack of old books or clothes, fond memories that we've discarded and might enjoy going over again. But I also hope to communicate some kind of things without speaking. I want people at work to know that I truly care about what we're trying to accomplish. I want my sons to grow up overwhelmed with the knowledge of how proud I am of them. I want my wife to feel my affection for her, breathed into every corner of our memories together. I'll tell them all these things, of course, but I hope they just kind of pick up on it.